I want to thank Garrett Christensen for agreeing to moderate this one. He's an economist at the U.S. Census Bureau, and the topic will be practical steps towards reproducibility. What should we actually do going forward? And after that, we'll have a group discussion for a similar topic for anyone who wants to hang out and chat for about a half an hour. So Garrett is an economist at the U.S. Census Bureau. Before that, he was a project scientist with the Berkeley Initiative for Transparent and Social Sciences and a data science fellow with the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. Along with Jeremy Fries and Ted Miguel, he is the author of Transparent and Reproducible Social Science Research, How to Do Open Science, the first textbook on open social science tools and practices, which Ted Miguel showed you all earlier and is now available. Joining him on the panel are Lars Vilhuber of the American Economics Association and Cornell University. Lars is the executive director of the Labor Dynamics Institute and a senior research associate in the economics department, both at Cornell. He works with the research and methodology directorate of the U.S. Census Bureau on a variety of projects and participates in several data access center committees. Since 2018, he's also been the American Economic Association's data editor, as well as the co-chair for JPAL's Innovations in Data and Experiments for Action initiative. Marie Garter is joining us from 3IE. She's the director of the Evaluation Office and the global director for innovation and country engagement at 3IE. She provides general leadership, strategic direction, guidance to 3IE's work, in addition to overseeing the Evaluation Office. She has over 17 years experience managing operational research projects with a development focus. She's previously held senior and managerial positions at the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, and the Inter-American Development Bank. Finally, Guadalupe Bedoya is joining us from the World Bank, in fact, from DIME. She's an economist at the Development Impact Evaluation team here at the World Bank. And the focus of her work is on understanding why interventions may or may not work to improve policy effectiveness. Her research interests include the design of accountability and measurement systems to improve the quality of service delivery, such as patient safety and quality of care, and interventions to promote sustainable livelihoods and poverty reduction. She received a master's degree from Princeton University and a PhD in public policy from the University of Chicago. She's also been one of our early adopters for reproducibility and technology in DIME, and has a lot to say on these topics as well. So please welcome the panel, and we'll let Garrett take it away.
Thanks. I'll just let the panelists talk, actually. So let's just start with closest to me. And I think we've been doing a great job so far today of having panels be discussions. So the panelists have agreed to keep their opening remarks to 10 minutes, and we'll have at least half the time to talk. So if Marie wants to take it away.
Sure, thank you. Is it on? No. Thank you very much, and great that sort of endurance by everyone. When I was trying to find the agenda for today, I kept looking at bits and dime, and I always got these sites about bitcoins and stuff. So bits and dime, yeah. So I've now realized what we're talking about today. As you heard a little bit in the morning, but I think some audience as well have changed around a little. 3IE is about promoting evidence-informed development policies and programs. And also to contribute to global evidence public goods. And that sort of is important. I mean, it sounds blah, blah, but it's actually important for how we sort of, what kind of approach as well we take to reproducibility and requirements we set and how we measure success. So so basically 3IE, ultimate success is sort of having an influence on the ground on policy making and programs. We actually track things like scale up of policies, change of policies, how studies inform design and implementation. Also how studies inform global policy discussions. So those are kind of the measures of success, not per se publications in peer-reviewed journals. And that sort of means that while, of course, the publications, and of course we all our reports, all the studies we support come out in reports at 3IE, they're open access and all that, of course, and that contributes to the evidence, the global public good. Nevertheless, it means that sort of having waiting for a long time before making the reports available and the data available is not sort of what we see as in the interest of the larger public. In terms of what the title was of this panel as well, it was not only about reproducibility, it was about credibility. And a reminder that for 3IE, our view of credibility is obviously not only whether a study reproduces or not, but it's whether it's useful on the ground. And it's also things like whether costs are taken into account, because if you're going to inform policy, you can't just have the impact estimate, so to speak. You need to have that. Also, and several people mention it, we need to know about implementation, because otherwise you cannot actually interpret your findings. And we see a lot of naivety about that, that not being done very well, and not taking implementation sufficiently into account. So those are some of the areas of credibility that we really want to sort of push the frontier of what we consider really rigorous impact evaluations. Now, in terms of reproducibility and replication, just to give a sense of what we're doing in this area. Yes, we talked about earlier today. We have started doing, after our introduction of our research transparency policy, push button replication. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But we also have replication programs. We've been running these replication programs. For example, the latest one for Gates was on financial services for the poor. And basically taking existing studies and getting different authors to sort of look at under what conditions, etc., the results replicate. And that's actually coming out in a special issue in our Journal of Development Effectiveness. So just a little plug for that, but also to say that journal, by the way, is one of those journals where we say explicitly, and there's an editorial statement there saying that we welcome no effect studies, and replication studies of various types. But also, in addition, we have recently, and Sridevi here has been doing some pure replication work, etc. So that's a new area of work. And of course, since the very beginning, we have a whole office that is dedicated to systematic reviews. And somebody talked about systematic reviews earlier, though didn't use that term. And that is something that at the end of the day is sort of replication. It's similar studies across different contexts, etc. And to look at forest plots, which were presented here, and doing meta-analysis. But it's how it differs from the typical meta-analysis that you see, or different sort of meta-reviews, is that it is done in a systematic way, where you actually tie your hands, in the sense, not tie your hands, but as we talked about before, there's a protocol early on where you say how you're going to be searching and what databases and so on. There's similarly sort of pre-analysis plan. Okay, so having said that, talking a little bit about, we mentioned in 2018 our research transparency policy. We felt it was necessary to put a lot of the things we were already doing out there in public, partly because sometimes it's easier to actually refer to policy when we get pushback as well. And also the pushback, by the way, might equally be from funders, and because we, again, work with funders. We're somewhere in between. We ourselves do research, but we also are grant reviewers of research, and basically, so we deal both with researchers and with funders. We talked about the research transparency policy earlier. I think one thing to note, we do all the things we talked about, pre-analysis plans, etc. What changed was that when with the push button replication, we found that we tied it basically to payments. That was the one thing that changed after the research transparency policy. So we said you will not get your last tranche payment until this replicates. And lo and behold, what Shayok didn't tell you earlier today is, if you actually, since the research transparency was introduced in April 2018, we had a 100% replication rate. So in terms of the next step of what works, this incentive work. And of course, as somebody said, we incentives work, yes. And there's always, what I'm curious about is there's always a side effect, something we haven't thought about. There's when you, and I'm still wondering about and when that is going to show up. But that was one thing. But in addition, of course, we didn't only sort of use the very crude stick of the payment, but there was also, of course, a lot of work went into working with grantees on helping them. How do you prepare your files? How do you do this in a good way? Explaining why it's helpful. And so I think Shayok might correct me, but sort of the pushback wasn't as big actually as we even had anticipated, and we put out sort of useful guidance as well in this area. A couple of other things. So some of the other things we also built into the tranche payments, such as a pre-analysis plan, etc. That's all it built into the tranche payments, and hence that's something that occurs throughout. Some thoughts on the funders and the researchers, and what are the next practical steps? We work with a lot of funders, and they vary enormously in their interest in this area, their awareness of how important it is. And I think, in some cases, there will be quite a lot of interest. They want the moon, in the sense they would like to have the data and rigorous research. They would like to have cost data. They would like to have it gender and equity, brought in, etc., which of course requires bigger sample sizes. There's a lot of things, and sometimes it's not necessarily so that they would also put the funding to match the interests. Other times we have a lot of discussions around what sort of IP arrangements should we have, and there are very differences between the different funders on what they require. And I think being sort of we sometimes would actually interact with the funders and probably say no, actually under those conditions we will not work with you. It's kind of tough, and I think one thing I would hope that one could do, and sort of maybe as a group work together to be 1 minute, okay? To sort of work together to sort of see under what conditions are we willing to work with funders, and when do we sort of as a group say no? Because there's a tendency that we sort of, they came with funds, so we'll do it. And so that's one sort of call for action, a little bit more sort of united front, if we get to sort of an agreed place where we should be at. The other thing is actually and this we haven't done sufficiently, we were talking about it, is actually to see what are the uses that have been made of the data that we have made public. And I think if we can actually get the lessons from that, that's a good story to tell funders as well. So, that is actually useful, and we, it's been used for other insights, and so on. So I think that will be helpful. I think for researchers, I think a lot of research, maybe this is a very biased sample in this room, perhaps, but a lot of it is just understanding what it is and how you can actually do your research better. So just having that kind of communication and even training, how it's not that hard if you get help. But then I think it's, from behavioral science, we talk about, it's not only incentives, but maybe also this making it social, making something the thing to do. Like in the US, nobody smokes anymore. It's sort of like it's become a taboo, but maybe sort of should become a taboo to sit on your data forever. and if everybody does it, then so maybe that's something to work with. The other thing, and something that we haven't utilized, I think, enough, and I'm a bit wary of using it, but it's also the fact that grantees come back. It's a repeated game. And if we started holding grantees somewhat more to account to the fact that they haven't answered us when we contacted them back and said, hey, where's the data and codes? Even if it wasn't in the grant agreement, we now have a policy. We'd like you to do it. Haven't heard back. Stop, he says. So you're very strict. So I think that's as well something that we could think of. It has its pros and cons. We'll probably won't get popular, but it's something to consider. Let me go slightly over time, just because I think it's a good idea. I think it comes from Center for Open Science. They have these badges, And I think that that's something we've been discussing. We'd really like to adopt that. It's again sort of both a carrot and a stick, depending on how you fare. But sort of that you get a badge for being your study replicated. You registered. You made the material open, etc. And I think that's something that I think could be an interesting incentive. I would love to use similar badges for funders, to see if they're actually supporting the research transparency and holding them to account as well. And I think that's something that we especially if we work together, I think that's something we could start doing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lars.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's been interesting to listen to the talks up to this point. I'll pick up on Marie's word of incentives. I am an incentive at present, which kind of means I'm the gatekeeper that, since we implemented the new policy, stands between you and publication after having run the gamut of all the referees' reports, etc. That is a measure of failure, because to some extent, it shouldn't even get to the point where we need a gatekeeper to assess reproducibility at the end point of a research process. By that time, it should be trivial. And so, to some extent, when I took up this position and presented my project to the AA Executive Committee, my vision had sort of two components on it. A, we need to actually enforce what we said we would want to do. And when I released a newer data and, as I inserted so importantly, I think, and code availability policy, I didn't actually change much. I just said we would enforce it, which hadn't been done before. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, my vision statement had the idea that if we actually do this right, my job is obsolete, hopefully 5, more likely 10 or 15 years from now, in the sense of we are all reacting to incentives. And if the incentive is you don't get published unless your code is reproducible, or your publication might be delayed because you have trouble that we end up finding years after you wrote that article, then the incentives are properly aligned for you to get it right in the first place. And so one of the key things that I also set out is that everything we do at the AA to do this has to be absolutely transparent. You need to know what you are being checked against, because I surely hope that you will read that and then do it before you submit, because it is so much easier to do it right from the start. And that goes to things like registering at the registry, the number of people that we have to say, at conditional acceptance, you didn't register. Do you remember that that's actually a condition of what you're doing if you're running an RCT, is too high, because it should be 0. The number of people that are coming around after the last revise and resubmit and say, oh, well, I didn't run that last code, that's why the numbers have changed, or I need to add this last piece to it because that's part of it, is one too many. And so the idea is to roll these incentives right back to the start and say, look, you're going through this process, and at the end, you're going to be checked on this, so you might as well do it right from the start and build it into a reproducible workflow. At present, I expect that when I say this will take 5 years at least to sort of weed itself out, is because we have a hump of research projects that did not start along those ways. And we have a hump of researchers whose culture it is not to do so, because they have their acquired practices of how you do research and how you share data and how you do all of these things. We'll have to wait for the dinosaurs to die out, and then hopefully we'll be in a better world. So in the meantime, I'm handling the dinosaurs, and hopefully somebody else can handle the teaching. We are running the replication, the verification of the computational reproducibility, entirely with undergraduate students. Now, that might sometimes be a relatively high bar in the sense that your README has to be interpreted by an undergraduate. But we're not asking that undergraduate to reinvent the algorithms you came up with or redo some of these things. We're asking them to follow instructions that, in principle, should be a push-button README and would make them obsolete, because all they need to do is figure out which particular flavor of push button that you're asking us to do. Is it a master do file? Is it a make file? Is it something fancier than that? Is it a compute capsule or some of the newer fangled things, which honestly I have seen nothing of so far? And so that is a relatively high bar, which on first pass about 40% of the articles actually pass. I hope that that will go up significantly, but there are many other contributors to that. And then they are being checked by us as well. Are you citing the data? Merce earlier meant that you can get a lot of reuse out of that. It's been our policy for years. It has not been enforced. That is almost persistently the key element of going back to the researcher. Describe how you got access to the data. Cite the data. You don't know how to cite the data because the data doesn't have a landing page? Well, we have guidance for that too, because you can. You don't need a DOI to cite the data, although it would be a lot better if you actually had one. So there are ways to sort of insert into the process a lot of these things. I mentioned that earlier in my comment in the earlier session. Where you got the data needs to be clear. At some level, it needs to be part of the transparent description of your research and the reproducibility. That process might be, here's a landing page at the Census Bureau, write a proposal, wait on 1.5 years until you finally get something back, walk into a locked room and do these kinds of things, and you can do so too. Thousands of researchers have done that. That is still transparent research. It is also reproducible research. It might be hard to verify, and it might be costly to verify, but that's on the same order of, for instance, the study I had the other day that said right at the top of the README, you're going to need 200,000 compute hours to do this analysis, but it's pretty simple otherwise. And so we didn't do that one just as much as we didn't do the one with restricted access data, because there are limits to what we can do at the stage that we are at, but that others could potentially help. These are things of moving back the procedures into something that if you'd started down that road early on, it would be relatively trivial. So let's move that back. It's graduate education. It is undergraduate education. Another perspective of why we're running this with undergraduate, they all want credit for what they're doing that I'm paying them to do. They want credit for it afterwards because they actually like it. And they're going to go out and apply it, maybe as your RAs, maybe in some private company out there, etc. This is actually a skill that we kind of all picked up and that we shouldn't have to just pick up. It should be part of the curriculum. And so ultimately, my hope is that 10 years from now, those undergraduates that we're training now are in the PhD program, and they're just going to be push button. And my job is obsolete because we just push the button and it's done, and we can have a machine to do that. So I'll stop there in terms of initial statements, and I know that Garrett has a couple of questions afterwards that we can go further on that, and stop there.
It's on the table.
Okay. So first, this was a team effort. So I did this with Amy Dollinger, Luisa Cardoso, Thomas Scande, and Camila Ayala. I'm not going to stop in the motivation because it has been given many times. I'm going to focus on code and data analysis practices, and basically the problem, or that was described here as well, is that we all mostly learn by self-teaching, right? And right now we are coming to a place where actually there are a lot of practices that are out there from software developers or the computer science that we could apply to actually do this better, right? The problem is that most of us didn't have them at the right time. We just learn it by doing without really good practice. So what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is answer 2 questions. What are the coding and data practices used by researchers and how they compare to select best practices? And what are some of the main constraints that researchers identify, and what may be some potential solutions for that? So when I was asked to present about this, I asked why me, because I'm just learning. And I was told that I was one of the high takers of all the things that DIME Analytics has. Me and my team, basically, because this is all a team effort, right? But it was weird that I just stopped, here to tell you about what I did. So what we did was actually to run a very fast survey. We sent basically a 10-minute survey to the 15 top development economics institutions, but measured by the IDEA's ranking. all professors or researchers in these institutions were received the email. So we didn't do like a specific targeting. So in the response rate, you are going to see that it's a little bit low, but basically because theories were there, people who are not doing development research were there, and they were answering this doesn't apply to me. Okay. But it was a good effort because we got a good number of answers. And then we did include the research assistants at time because I wanted to see the difference between the PIs and the RAs. And basically the rest is just a lot of inputs from the DIME analytics team. And we also use the guidelines by Genskov and Shapiro, who did a very good practice for framework. Okay, so basic statistics about the sample. So basically we got responses for 99 PIs and 25 research assistants in DIME, just so that you have a sense of who we are talking about. On average, the PI had 14 years of experience, like many established researchers answered this, some of them big names in development economics that actually answered the email saying done. So that was nice to see. On average, because this becomes more and more difficult when the teams are big. On average, they have 2.7 co-authors or 2.5 arrays, and on average, they use 1 array per project. They said that in the last 2 years, they have on average 4.4 projects in the either data analysis or submission phase. And I found this interesting that 42% of them said that they do most of the coding. By the age or the experience, this is logical that, like you trust less the arrays. And in terms of response rate, what did I do? Okay. So we have a 15% response rate for the whole sample. This was for the basically around 800 people were targeted. For the DIME PI was 71%, and for the DIME array, 63%. So to your question about whether you overpay the $80, maybe so, because 15% was including the theories, people who don't do development economics, and the survey was just 2 emails, follow-ups, and they were very good about it. So maybe you did overpay. Okay, so the first question that we asked is, how prepared do you think you are for the new policies that were implemented from the AA in July? And this is the PI results. On average, they feel that they are more or less prepared, but not quite there, right? 3.5 over 5. So we selected a few practices. So it's not going to be exhaustive, but just to give you a flavor of where people are and where are the main constraints. And there is, just to say that this is not, what we are going to talk about is not the specific things that one thing that people need to be followed, but the concepts are well known to be helping improving reproducibility and avoiding mistakes in coding. Oh, I keep doing this. Okay, so basically I'm going to talk about version control, automation, management, and code review. I'm not going to stop defining them because they have been discussed widely in this session. So basically, this is the first one. The question was, what strategies or tools do you use to track different versions of your data, code, or outputs? Basically, the best practice is to use version control software, but only 30% of them actually use it, okay? Most people use either initials or dates of the people who are changing, and that is proven to be not only difficulty, it makes it difficult to reproduce it, but it's difficult for yourself later on to try to understand, what is the right version. The people who use version control software, most of them is GitHub, and this is more or less what is good for. I'm not going to stop again in defining it. Based on Genskov and Shapiro, they have these 2 rules, and I'm going to be putting them there, but I'm going to go a little bit fast on this just to make sure that I keep in time. The second is management of coding tasks, right? So the question was, how do you team commonly use the assigning tasks for data and data analysis? Basically, 80% is email, and there are other tools that actually are project management tools that are less used. Dropbox and GitHub issues, etc., are there. Basically, what Genskov and Shapiro said is email is not a task management tool. I just want to emphasize that, okay? And this is just makes difficult for the documentation. Remember that coding and coding practices is not only about the code, it's also about the documentation so that people can follow what the decisions, how the decisions were made, right? If you have a project management tool or you use the GitHub issues, everything is going to be there and anybody can understand what was the process to follow that. automation and abstraction. I just have two things here that we analyze. So first is whether there was a process for RAs to actually improve their abstraction and automation skills. And just only 30% actually have one. 40% said that they encourage it as peer review, but there is no systematic. And how the basic structure of the directory is established, because I found that was a big issue for me when I started. Most of them vary for project, and even the ones that are fixed, they are done manually mostly versus just running a code. And when Chris developed the I folder, I was like so thankful because I don't have to worry about that anymore. You know, it's the same structure and you run it in the code in GitHub and that's it. It's automatic. Here are the rules. In code review, it's very difficult to know what is the best practice here, but just so that you know, most of them, or 48% do internal code review, but most people, 91%, don't do external code review. Perceived benefits and constraints. So the question was, would you benefit for any of these tools, or for learning or using more in your team and your projects? Basically, it's yes. People think that they would benefit, and mostly, particularly about coding practices and everything that is actually automating the processes. When we ask what do you think are the main constraints, basically it's lack of time or that the entry cost is too high, right? Then the training didn't seem to be an issue. It's just this, and what is hiding behind that is a question mark. We asked also questions about whether you have received training on these practices, right? And basically, this all are responses from PIs, and they themselves haven't received training in most of them. Around 30% have. And whether they know, to the best of their knowledge, whether they're research manager or their RAs, and basically most of them haven't. It's 30%, 40%, but many don't know. How easily could you find trainings or resources within the organization? Basically, it varies, but it's closer to 3 points out of 5. And this is the comparison with Dime. And the reason why we did it with Dime is that we do have all the trainings in-house, right? And that is what my team has started and has been adopting this, is that at some point I told everybody we are not doing data analysis and other tool than GitHub, right? And so everybody had to go and get trained, etc. So my question and the reason for this survey is, why wouldn't this take up be higher in Dime if we have all the instruments? So basically the same issues arise, it's lack of time. And I don't know what the best practices are or the entry cost. So how to address that? I like these two responses because they are very different. One of them seems to from a very well-seasoned researcher. He said, in each project, one co-author is responsible of supervising the work of the RAs. Each RA working in a project is provided with the protocols, etc. But very importantly, they say that at the end, before publication, they have an external RA who actually does the coding without looking at the original code, which actually would be best practice, according to me, very costly, but best practice. What we do in Dime is basically that once the code there is somebody in the team that runs or reviews the code that was already done. And then there was another person that said, I have a formula for doing this project based on my experience as a professional programmer that most of us are not. It does not involve these tools. But again, so sometimes to conclude, embedding these practices from the beginning. So at the beginning, when I went to the first training for GitHub, I wasn't thinking of publication. I was thinking that every time that an array comes or goes, it's so difficult even to understand what they did. So for institutional memory, that is why I implemented that. We started doing this every time that we start data collection. But it also improves efficiency. The amount of things that we don't have to do anymore is impressive. So I think that people are underestimating the benefits, and the cost is there, but people are underestimating potentially the benefits. The other thing is that people think they have to learn everything, and I answered the survey. I haven't received training in all the things that my RAs have. You don't need to know everything. You need to know a minimum amount and then have people in charge of the different elements, right? So I think that's a little bit of misunderstanding. I think in the long run, in the long term, there is a role for academic institutions, because what Lars said is very true. We don't have the training. So if in the long term, students and RAs come already with the training, this is not necessary anymore because they are going to do it from scratch. in the medium term and short term, institutions like the ones who are sponsoring this workshop are key, because in the transition I wouldn't have been able to do this and my team without the dime analytics. It's just too costly to try to do it. And overcoming the barriers to changing habits and norms seems critical, and I think all the incentives put by the AEA are key to actually do this. Oh, sorry, this is very important. We have it in GitHub already, so you can go and see it.
All right, excellent. I have a couple questions I prepared in advance and shared with the panel, and one quick follow-up, though. You mentioned iFolder, I think. Can you explain that in a few sentences?
Yeah, so I think it was Chris and with the team that they developed a tool that is actually about, it's in state of right in the state. In the iToolkit, they have a command that actually creates the folders fix for every project, so we don't have to think about it anymore. And then there is some flexibility embedded that then you can have some subfolders. But now we don't think about that anymore. It's just embedded in the coding. So.
Excellent.
All the tools and the links are in the presentation.
Okay, fantastic. So this is our panel is on practical steps. I feel like we've been hearing from all these organizations all day about practical steps. And we previously heard from 3IE and DIME, so it's good to get the AEA's position from Lars. So my two questions. The first one, so what can research organizations do to support reproducibility practices, particularly those that have lower technical capacity? And since we're at the World Bank, we're talking we're dealing with lower and middle income countries, or just not top flight academic institutions, these departments with less technical capacity. What can organizations that you represent do to support adoption of these practices at those types of institutions? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Okay, so I'll go first. What they can do to support it, we've already heard from two. Those are examples of these practices. I'll actually go a bit out on a limb and say there are actually far more practices that haven't been mentioned that we've heard, for instance, in the earlier discussion about, for instance, making data accessible when data is difficult to access because of a variety of rules. And those are incumbent to a large extent on organizations as well, because to do it ad hoc is not always easy. You might not always have the institution or place to go to sort of store your data when data can't be simply published. And I'm going to abstract from all the public use data that does still exist that you can just drop into Dataverse, OpenICPSR, or whatever. But rather thinking about, for instance, the World Bank or maybe I3 in terms of what about the confidential data that you could make more visible and provide access mechanisms to do so? Could there be a World Bank RTC, a virtual instance that you can access some of the data that you are not allowed to share publicly, but that you are allowed to share with other researchers subject to whatever the constraints are going to be, right? The crimson or red or whatever criterion that is. That is an institutional investment that may work both internally and externally and increase the credibility of some of these things. We've talked about training. I think that's key to this, and I'm going to put the onus for long term on this on those institutions that are not necessarily present here, namely the universities. This isn't just a well-funded research institution capacity. This needs to be part of the curriculum, and that is the ultimate key to these kinds of things. And that's not expensive, because you are already hiring faculty to do this, and there should be faculty who should know how to do this and convey that further on to their students. And this is at any level of community college or other things. I see these practices starting to seep into some high schools, and maybe this is still at the AP level, but it's certainly not out of scope to do that, to think about some reproducible practices. My kids going through high school learned how to cite data. I sometimes wish my graduate students know how to cite data the way they learned it. And so these are practices that are sort of migrating back into something that we should be taking for granted really soon. And then finally, the idea that I'd like to put out there as well, I've mentioned in my earlier comment about the French folks, the idea of having an independent unit within a research institution is particularly relevant for research institutions. It's kind of related to what you guys are already doing. It's kind of related to what JPEL has been doing as well, or IPA, in the sense the credibility of your research institution hinges on the credibility of the research of the people that you're supporting. And those staff of yours, even if you dissociate yourself in whatever disclaimer you have in the footnote, they are your poster of what the quality of the research is at this. So shouldn't there maybe be some support for this to sort of say, and we've had that RA do this and post that publicly as this is policy and we did this, again, as a footnote maybe in the paper or something like that. That is not standard yet, and that is a question of how do you do that across all sectors of all the papers that you do as a general infrastructure within the institution. So I'll stop there.
So a couple of things. I think, first of all, I mean, it's sort of a good place to start is to level the playing field. A lot of the researchers in low and middle-income countries are kept back by things like no access to IRB, the problem of a lot of journals not being open access, so not having necessarily the funds to access, the type of research and publications that you could learn from, etc. So leveling the playing field, I think, would be a good place to start. But of course, that's sort of evading sort of more personal responsibilities for what one can do. I think, certain ideas like, for example, making, as you mentioned as well, making having maybe a sort of a funding program, for example, where we support researchers from low and middle-income countries as well and students, etc., to work with existing data sets and see new and interesting questions, etc., to look into. I think that would be an interesting thing to do. I think the other, we actually do have sort of these work in sort of select developing countries more sort of on the ground, building capacity, working with research organizations, and sort of to a lesser extent, children in sort of lower levels of education. But what would be interesting is to make, to bring all the tools available that we have seen, that we discussed here, make them available in those trainings. Maybe sort of similarly to what we've done in India, where we have started to have conferences and workshops around transparency and open access, etc. Sort of that has been, there's a craving for that. So one thing is also to sort of whether as a group we can come together and make this, the trainings and workshops available. I think the thing to look at and would be interesting for us to think about in 3IE is how much of this could we do with little needs for additional funds, and where do we have to go put together a package and say this is really interesting and actually go to get funders to focus on this. But I think that would be really interesting and potentially much more successful if we went together, several institutions.
So I'm going to talk about the code reproducibility, and my experience was that it was very hard at the beginning. Even though I wanted to do it, the first day that I went to the GitHub training, that was an entire day, I was like, this is impossible. It went for here, and you just learn it by doing. And actually what the PI needs to know is a very limited part of it. And then you keep working in state out R or whatever you know, you're not changing that. But it took many months for me to realize that, because we were just learning on the process, and Time Analytics helped a lot, and they were learning on the process on what is it that the PI needs to know, etc. But it was the same with Asana, with the management tool. And the first time that it was introduced, for me, it was because we started working with a software developer in India to develop a monitoring system, and they were like, "Are you crazy? I don't want to receive the code instructions by email. Let's use Asana," right? And it took for me and my team a year scared to actually take it up. No, because it was difficult, but because it was difficult to understand where were the main functions that will make our life easier. So it has so many things to do at the beginning, you get overwhelmed. So basically, for teams like Dime Analytics, so the teams that are in all the different organizations, creating kind of like simple tools of what is it that minimum you need to learn, and then sessions that are short and not one day, because they don't need one day. You just go like this. You only learn by doing. These kind of things that we learn with pain in our team can facilitate the adoption. Training is necessary. Knowing where to go if you don't know something is necessary. So tips like Dime Analytics are necessary. Again, I wouldn't have been able to do it or my team without them. But like facilitating that transition, I think with checklists and good training, I think that's one thing.
One thing I forgot to mention, Ashayok mentioned it in the morning, but I think it was really an interesting comment that he made, that in fact the research assistants and associates that you were working with, was basically they didn't know Stata before they ran this, and it was still doable, similar to what you're saying. I mean, so you can actually learn these to do sort of some step by step, is possible, and that's I think very hopeful.
So I'm hearing from all of you that the youth are the future. So, okay. Is there any? I have another question, but does anybody in the audience want to tag on to this specific lower income limited resources thing? We'll take a question or two from the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. At Dime Analytics, this is not something we had budgeted for when we started out the scale up of Dime. It's something that became a necessity because of scale problems. So, as we were scaling up, there were lots of growth pains, as I explained earlier. And what we were trying to do is really reduce the cost of doing this work on a really large scale with lots of people. Bits helped. So, for example, Gareth came out, and this is when a lot of us got the first GitHub exposure, is how to even start a workflow like this. This was years back. And now
I'm sorry.
Now we've adopted it in a large scale, but it's really reduced the cost of doing what we do now. Because we have a lab structure, we're quite a large research team, 25 economists. So, there are economies of scale that kick in. I think they kick in for some of the organizations that are here today. I think it's going to be a lot harder for, universities that have maybe 2 applied micro people working on development issue to really create. So this is kind of what we can offer, is really this public good value. How can we help others? And we think at the bank particularly, but I think the JPAL IPA networks are similar. We reach out to a very large community of applied researchers, and so if we change the norm inside these walls, we can really affect the norm outside, even in the absence of high-powered incentives, which are welcome. But I think this is how it's been working.
Fernando, did you have a related question or point?
No, a different question.
Well, let me ask this one more question that I sent to the panel ahead of time, sort of relating this all to intellectual property rights. We're on the panel economists, so I think we understand this analogy that patents and copyrights expire after a time. Is this appropriate to make this analogy to research products and collected data and possibly copyright? I know Lars has feelings about licenses that basically economists don't know what they are, and they should. So do we like that analogy, and how do we think that applies to our work and transparency?
You're staring at me. So I don't have feelings, I have opinions. But I have very strong opinions. I guess 3 facts. For one, as part of the data policy, we also initiated that the AEA has a proper data repository at OpenICPSR. Let the specialists take care of the data curation part. We'll take care of some of the other aspects to it and not reinvent the wheel. And as part of that, we are migrating the 3,815 data supplements that we have collected over the past 15 years into that same data repository. I'm going to go out on a limb that the percentage of zip files that we've received over the past 15 years that has a license in them is close to 0. It is not 0, but it's close to 0. We can write about the economics of patents, but we don't apply it to our own science. So it's certainly not something I ever learned. I think it's one of the most underestimated skills that one should actually learn, is how to put a proper license on the work that we are doing, because it is not trivial. You can't just slap a CC BY license on and be done with, because that might not be the best thing that you want to do with it, starting with the fact that CC BY shouldn't be applied to code. The other thing about that is, and this relates to the expiry of patents, in doing my first year of this, I did a very ad hoc survey of anybody that would respond to this, starting with all of the AEA editors about what they thought about this process, but a few select big data folks as well that had done papers using challenging data such as Facebook or Uber and things like that, and what they thought about reproducibility. And one comment stuck. One of these researchers said, yeah, I have all these data files that are sitting on my shelf as zip disks or something like that, and I have a data testament about the data that I acquired, and should it ever come to pass, what happens with those. Whether or not he actually has the right to do that is a different question, but he said somewhere along the line I just need to decide that when I can no longer give consent, what should happen, whether that's because I exited academia or whatever else might happen. And so the idea that there might actually even be more complicated licenses that says, okay, for the first 10 years, you can use my data for replication purposes only, and otherwise I'm the only one who can use this data because I'm going to write 3 other papers with it, might not be quite the open access ethos, but it's certainly a feasible license. And then there might be a fuse on it that X years from now, without my further interaction, this becomes generally available. And we've had discussions like that as well at the Census Bureau about how should we think about things that go through disclosure avoidance rules and are published out there as quasi-public use data, that we give the authors sort of a first right to publish, but that if they never decide to do anything with it, just disappears into the ether. Wouldn't the public good be best served by having an expiring license on it? You get 5 years to do it, and then it becomes public because you didn't exploit it, let somebody else do it. And so there's questions surrounding that are, I think, absolutely worthwhile to investigate, but that are far on the fringes of the discussion, at least as economists, of doing so. I'd be curious, I haven't looked into it, whether or not in computer science you actually learn what license to put on your code, because most computer sciences do have some of that on there. But is that just rote, I picked the MIT license for something, or is there actually some thinking about these processes as they sort of evolve? So I think that's one of the most difficult and vague things out there about that. And when I asked the AEA editorial office about what license actually sits on top of all those replication archives, those 3,800 that we actually got, the answer was not sure. A careful reading of the forums is that actually you signed copyright to the AA when you published the article, including all the supplemental materials that you gave them. And then the AA didn't put a license on the files, so all replication attempts that anybody has done here, they were copyright infringement. Might be fair use, I don't know. And so we actually had to think about what license should we put on to make it clear that these archives actually have something on it. And there were some discussions with counsel and things like that, what the appropriate license might be that the A might agree to. Simpson has a comment on that.
Yeah, just a few things, since you kind of channeled me. The first thing is that we don't have copyright on databases in this country. And so it's not clear to me that you can cover a data set with copyright. That would be a question for Pamela Samuelson at Berkeley, but I know that we don't have a database copyright in this country. That doesn't mean in other countries, right? Because copyright's a national thing.
We don't have a copyright on data, but on databases, the compilation itself, there is a copyright possible.
Well, Pam told me otherwise. She is a lawyer, and you are not. So I actually asked her if it was covered under compilation copyright, and she told me no, it was not. But, she could be wrong. The other thing is, as far as what licenses people choose in computer science, pretty much people choose whatever license they want, but the problem that we've had is that there are license conflicts that happen. And there are some licenses that actually cannot coexist with other licenses. And because of that, the Open Software, the Open Software Institute, whoever they are, came up with a set of requirements. And so there are a certain set of licenses that are known not to conflict with each other. But a related problem is that people can make up their own licenses because they're just copyright agreements. And so like we've dealt with code that said anybody can use this except the US military. And then I was at a military university and we couldn't use that code, right? And so the same could be done with statistical programs.
So in 3IE, we don't talk explicitly about licenses, but we basically have our research transparency policies is quite clear that it's 6 months after the draft report 12 months after the draft report or 6 months after the final report has been submitted. The data and code should be in the public domain. And of course, before that, we have already required it for internal push-button replication, so we have it. And so we will by then, if it hasn't been, we haven't been allowed to do so before, we will at the expiry date make it public. And that's something that is clear in the grant agreement, so that's what the researchers sign up to. So there's your implicit sort of license to...
Do you actually mean true public domain or some open?
On our Dataverse, yeah.
Well, the question was about public domain actually means you relinquish all rights to it, including the right to being cited. That's why I was asking that question.
Public domain is a specific license, like CC0, right? It means like nothing, anyone can use it like without citing it. But the lack of a license is, okay. It's a waiver, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With the Harvard Dataverse, we have the default CC0 for data because we also, from some lawyers, we were recommended that would be the more appropriate, if we wanted to make it as open as possible, the most appropriate, not license, but waiver, right? The part about it is true that doesn't require to cite the data, but on the other hand, Dataverse is very much fun. Well, it was created based on data citation as the incentive for data sharing. But what we're saying is that data citation should be part of the scholarly norm as it is citing papers, right? And it should become the practice, the standard practice, and it shouldn't be forced by a license because we're not forcing that in a paper either. So that was the argument. Maybe we're wrong, but it was the why we came to that conclusion. Of course, you could assign, if you want, another type of license to a data set in Dataverse, but that's the default to encourage open data.
This just made me start to wonder, are there any accepted guidelines about authorship for data sets or so they can be cited? And I mean, because it shouldn't necessarily be the same as the PI, or should it?
Our general academic contribution guidelines that I don't think that they specifically target data sets, but as for any work, if you did not contribute to this work, then you shouldn't be on there, right? So in theory, that means if you say you've got a 3-author paper and one author just wrote the theory and the other 2 prepared and did the analysis, that on the data set itself, it might only be those 2. That's weak guidance. In econ, we tend to not highlight what each contribution was. Other domains are a bit more precise about that in terms of author contribution statements and things like that. I'm not aware of specific guidance, but...
Yeah, so that was discussed as part of the data citation principles, the joint data citation principles that were started as part of Force 11 initiative, right, an organization for scholarly communication. There is in the Research Data Alliance organization has a working group that is working on that. I don't know if they have published their consensus on this, but it's part of those principles. And we also have a paper with a couple of co-authors that provide some recommendations. Is in the medical journal. So there are a few things happening. But I think it's very much based on that it should be. I don't know if you're familiar with the credit, CREDIT for roles, specifying roles in a publication, whether it's a paper or any other research object, and so providing a more who contributed to the collection, who contributed to the analysis, who contributed that. So it's sort of adjacent, allows you to tag the contributions of the different roles.
So Ben, so we're out of time, but maybe Benjamin wants to say the last word or take us to the next thing or just ask the question. We were communicating via hand signals, and it was...
No, actually, all of those would be great. If anyone else wants to go before I do take the mic, please go ahead for one more. Otherwise,
yeah, the last question.
I had one question, slash wild or unfeasible idea, but would it be possible for when it comes to like citations of data, when asking reviewer, when submitting your papers and going through the citations? Would it be possible to ask or encourage authors to, when they cite a paper, if they're using the data, they cite the paper, and then they cite the data as a different citation, because that, in essence, that will kind of like raise the value of a paper that has data that is citable. It makes it. I don't know if it's feasible, but
I think that's what a lot of Dataverse encourages you to do. Like you get a DOI when you post the data, so like absolutely reference that.
No, but what I was thinking more on the lines of the reviewers or the journal, kind of saying, you're citing this paper. Are you using the data of this paper? Hence, you should cite the data, something like that.
Journals, at least in political science that we're working with, they're already recommending that to put the data citation in the reference list. Also, as part of the joint declaration of the data citation principles, that's one of the principles. That's how you should do. At least it's a recommendation, yeah.
And so for the AE, I'll say two things. One is that with the new policy, everything goes over our data review team, and the RAs are told if there is data being used, it has to be cited. Otherwise, it goes back and gets fixed. From the perspective of an ad hoc survey of senior economists, they don't care about the data being cited. They want the paper to be cited because you don't get tenure with or reputation with the data being cited. You want your paper in the AR to be cited, not your data on Dataverse, even though you might do both. So in practice, I have them cite both. They're going to automatically cite the paper, and then in addition, they cite the data. The interesting juxtaposition typically comes from they're using 4 data sources, say World Bank census and 2 supplementary data that came along with the paper. They will cite the 2 papers, and they won't cite the 2 data sources that do not have a paper associated with it. So the practice is that papers are the only object that is citable, and that changes with the data citation principles to some extent. So in practice, cite both.
Last word.
I was allowed to ask a question because So one thing that we've started recently, and I forgot to mention it, but it's basically around the baseline time to already introduce researchers to do push button replication. It's at the time where you don't have to have your results. It's sort of less controversial. It's early in the project, so we're doing that. But in that context, has come up the issue that. For a lot of governments we deal with, they are much more interested in the baseline reports and the insights from there than the eventual impact evaluations. That's the fact. And so, what do you all? What's your views on that? And have you had any experience with sort of sharing while you're still doing your study, sharing the baseline data? And consider, and you can imagine certain type of research where that wouldn't really matter. You wouldn't necessarily then bias the follow-up study, etc. But any sort of guidance on that, because it's an internal discussion we have.
I'm going to hijack that one and use it to transition to the last segment. I think it's a great place to start. I think the last couple of questions have been really related to something that I kind of wanted to pile onto as well, which is that, I was trained primarily in economics, but most of the work I've done has been in health. So if you look at any of my papers, there are very few that have single-digit numbers of authors, right? And it's so-and-so did data collection, so-and-so did project conception, so-and-so, arranged the data access, so-and-so did the field work, so-and-so did the analysis, right? And most of them are junior authors, right? So it's not like you see in typical, I would say economics journals where there's 2 or 3 kind of PIs who kind of get the paper. What we've also done a lot is publish baseline papers that are just kind of descriptive approaches to a new data set, which is interesting in and of itself, and can be done with very little work in medical journals because 3,500 words is out the door. So I think a really interesting thing, particularly from the economics perspective, is how can we improve or make more things citable, either by providing different ways to do that. Again, I think the pre-results review is one way, but certainly, bringing data sets to that standard by encouraging that is a complete description of the data set and what was done would be incredible. I'm sure lots of other people have lots of other ideas on that, but basically making more of these objects exist legally, professionally, officially would certainly help a lot of people's careers who are the ones producing them and then ending up as a footnote. So I would, start by taking that group of questions, which was a common theme of the last couple of comments, and put it out to the group, especially those who come from different disciplines, to kind of help us out, because increasingly we have that large number of junior staff who aren't necessarily going anywhere anytime soon, aren't in academic positions, particularly here at the bank, right? It's not an academic position, and the number of labs where it's career tracks is